On the 29th of September 2006, police in Glasgow made an horrific discovery under the floor of a local church. The mutilated body of 23-year-old student Angelica Cluk, who'd been missing for almost a week.
She was put under there, he stabbed her and he raped her. He left her dead.
The last person seen with Angelica was 60-year-old church handyman Peter Tobin, a man with a history of violent sexual abuse.
He's very reliant on this superficial charm that he's developed and that he rolls out whenever he identifies a victim. And this will essentially lead his victims to let their guard down.
The investigation into Angelica's murder would uncover a series of shocking crimes dating back as far as the early 1990s.
Tobin defies even my imagination. There is something about him that sends a shiver down my spine every time I think about it.
Peter Tobin had been unmasked as one of the world's most evil killers. It was a case that spanned 2 decades. By the time Peter Tobin was found guilty of murdering teenage hitchhiker Dinah McNichol in 2009, he'd already been in prison for 2 years. He was serving life sentences for the murders of Angelica Cluk and 15-year-old schoolgirl Vicky Hamilton. The 63-year-old serial killer and rapist had buried all 3 girls across a 15-year period, 1 in Scotland and 2 on the south coast of England.
Another awful discovery at 50 Irvine Drive. A body bag thought to contain the remains of Dinah McNichol, brought out from what was the most ordinary of houses. It is no longer.
I think what sets Tobin apart for me is the sheer relentless brutality of him. A man who genuinely paid no attention whatever to anything but his own basest instinct. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, and could get away with it.
Former Detective Superintendent David Swindle from Strathclyde Police first came across Tobin after the body of Angelica Cluk was discovered at St Patrick's Church in Glasgow in 2006. The 23-year-old Polish student had been missing for 5 days.
Coming back to the church today brings it all back to me. The horrors of what must have happened here. Unbelievable. You could never imagine it. A place of worship desecrated by Peter Tobin doing what he did to Angelica Cluk.
But when they arrested Tobin, police were convinced this wasn't his first murder. David set up Operation Anagram, a task force charged with finding out more about the life and crimes of Peter Tobin.
When we looked at his life in Operation Anagram, we found that he frequented places like this: churches, religious establishment, homeless persons, hostels. How many people frequented the places that Tobin frequented? How many people did he meet that were vulnerable at that time, that had no relatives to report them missing? How many of these were missing and were never reported missing that Tobin has killed? We'll never know. Tobin knows the answer.
His story begins over 70 years ago. Peter Tobin was born in Johnstone, Scotland, 13 miles east of Glasgow, on the 27th of August, 1946.
He was part of this post-war baby boom generation. He came from quite a large family. He was one of 8 children. His dad worked for the local council and his mother was a housewife. And by all accounts, he was a bit of a wild child.
Some suggest that he was violent towards his siblings and quickly developed a habit of minor thefts and occasional burglary.
By the age of 7, he was in reform school, and that is something that is quite significant here, because these places where these boys went were quite brutal in terms of the regime, in terms of the treatment by staff. Lots of children misbehaved, lots of children went off the rails, but I think you had to be quite extreme to find yourself in a reform school.
As Tobin grew up, this childish rebellion developed into an entirely reckless disregard for the law.
Now, as a young man, Peter Tobin moved around a lot. He did a lot of low-skilled jobs and moved from place to place. And he would often get involved in property crime. He was convicted of burglary and fraud. So here's somebody who breaks the law time and time again and is seemingly okay with it. So he's crossed that boundary. He crossed that boundary a long time ago. And I think for most of his life, he's constantly pushing that further and further.
At the age of 22, Tobin began a relationship with 17-year-old Margaret Mountney. The pair were married in August 1969, by which time they had relocated from Glasgow to Brighton.
It all seemed to start rather well. He was incredibly charming, he was incredibly attentive, but it soon degenerated into something altogether different. He would regularly beat her up and lock her in the house. He was cruel towards her pets. He actually decapitated her pet puppy.
A number of the women who've had relationships with Tobin say that he can be very charming for quite a long period until you'll find that he becomes very violent. The women who've known him often talk about this ability to turn on a sixpence, to suddenly become horrific, when in fact, moments earlier, he was being perfectly nice or charming. It is part of Tobin's characteristic. He is an evil man hiding in plain sight.
He knows what women want to hear, so he will use that charm offensive in the early days, but his true colours will soon shine through. And by then, unfortunately, it's too late. He's really chipped away at these women's confidence and their self-esteem, and they're very much under his control.
The troubled relationship didn't last. After Tobin was sent to prison for 3 years for burglary, the couple divorced in 1971. After serving his sentence, Tobin wed again in 1973, but this marriage was equally as violent, and by 1976 it was over.
Peter met his third wife, Cathy Wilson, in 1986, and there was quite an age difference. She was 16 at the time, and he was around 40. So she was very young, she was very vulnerable, she was very impressionable, and he turned on the charm again, and she moved in with him very quickly, and they had a child together.
The couple were married in Brighton in 1989, and Tobin moved his young bride and their son far away from her family to Bathgate in West Lothian in 1990.
Now, this relationship went pretty much the same way as his other marriages had gone. He was incredibly controlling, he was incredibly abusive. He didn't like her leaving the home. He would make sure that she didn't go out and didn't talk to anybody. And she eventually fled. She eventually summoned up the courage to leave this relationship. And she only did that through secretly saving up bus fare for a very long time in order to travel to England with her son.
Despite their relationship ending, 45-year-old Tobin moved back to the south of England in 1991 to be close to his young son. He settled on Irvine Drive in Margate, Kent. His next-door neighbour at the time was Dave Martin.
Well, the picture he painted for the community was a nice, steady bloke, no loud parties, no loud music. He was not an annoyance in any way. If you were stuck or you had a problem, you only had to ask him and he'd give you a hand, he'd help out.
But Dave soon saw a sinister side to his friendly neighbour.
We'd be outside and a couple of young girls would walk past and he said, "Cool, how about them?" And I would say, "Don't be stupid, Pete, you're old enough to be their father." "Oh, yeah," and he'd laugh it off.
After 2 years in Margate, out of the blue, Tobin moved on again.
All of a sudden, the house next door was empty. No ifs, no buts. I shrugged my shoulders at the time. I thought, well, he's moved on. He was a little bit on the weird side anyway, so I didn't give that a lot of thought neither.
By 1993, Tobin was living in a flat at Havant on the south coast of England. His violent nature was about to turn even more sinister. On the 4th of August 1993, Tobin was at home with his 5-year-old son when two 14-year-old girls came to visit one of his neighbours.
They knocked on next door and discovered there was no one in. Tobin saw an opportunity, invited the two girls to wait in his flat with his son, after all, what could be less threatening.
As his 5-year-old son slept, Tobin drugged both girls using a chemical called amitriptyline and sexually assaulted them before leaving them for dead.
He'd subjected them to quite a violent sexual assault, and it was only when his son interrupted this assault that it finished, essentially. And Peter called his ex-wife, claiming that he was having a heart attack, and this was about 2 o'clock in the morning.
He turned the gas on in the flat and then proceeded to leave with his son, presumably hoping that they would die of asphyxiation from the gas.
But the girls regained consciousness and managed to escape before calling the police. Journalist Martin Brunt remembers hearing about the sickening attack.
2 schoolgirls, 14 years old, had been held prisoner in a flat, had been plied with drink and drugs, had been raped, and then left in the flat with the gas turned on. And whoever had done it had effectively left them to die. Very quickly, police announced that they were looking for a man called Peter Tobin.
40 days after the attack, and using the alias Peter Wilson, Tobin was found and arrested in Brighton. On May the 18th, 1994, at Winchester Crown Court, he pleaded guilty to rape and indecent assault and was sent to jail for 14 years. But he served just 10 and was released in 2004.
He changed his name so he wouldn't appear in the serious sex offenders register, wouldn't set off any alarm bells anywhere, and got a job as a church handyman back in Glasgow.
When a man called Pat McLaughlin came looking for refuge at St Patrick's Church, the priest and charity workers who took him in had no idea they were offering sanctuary to a man who would commit an act of absolute evil right under that very roof. Members of the local charity group Loaves and Fishes, Dennis and Kathy Curran, remember the night McLaughlin came looking for refuge.
I met Patrick McLaughlin in May 2006. It was a wild night, and he came in for something. He said he was homeless. They had nothing to eat, and we gave him food.
This was a really, really terrible night. I've never seen anything like that in my life. We were just ready to go when he came into the door. And he came in and he said he was hungry and that, and we said, right, but Father Jerry had told him that anybody was frightened to go out into the night and nowhere to sleep, they could sleep inside the church.
Throughout his life, Tobin, who was born and brought up a Catholic, had a persistent connection with the Catholic Church, and at various points during his periods on the run or disappearing or adopting false identities, took refuge in Catholic churches and Catholic communities. I think it was simply that was somewhere where he felt comfortable, where he knew how to conduct himself, where he could hide in plain sight. He could conceal his true nature behind the facade of a church handyman or a member of a Christian community. And that was a very safe way to conceal the reality of what he wanted.
To Tobin, nothing was sacred. He took advantage of the open nature of the Currans and the community of St Patrick's.
He was with us maybe about 6, 7 weeks, something like that. And then he started giving Father Jerry a hand in the church, and he's doing bits and pieces. People don't understand you can be with somebody a full day and they never spoke. You know what I mean? People find that hard to understand. There was nothing to sort of, it was a yes and no. That's what it was, a yes and a no.
Peter Tobin was an incredibly manipulative individual. He wasn't particularly emotionally complex himself, but he had a really good understanding of other people's emotions. He knew what other people needed to hear, and he used that to get what he wanted.
Kathy, however, had concern for the ominous stranger who joined their community.
I says to Dennis that there was something far wrong with him. I wasn't too sure what it was, but as far as I could understand, that the jigsaw with Pat McLaughlin wasn't all fitting together. There was something not right there.
But Tobin's next step was more evil than any of them could have predicted. Angelica Cluk was a 23-year-old student from Skotzau near Krakow in Poland who was working as a cleaner in St Patrick's Church. On the 24th of September 2006, she disappeared. Dennis broke the news to his wife.
He said, that girl, Angelica Cluk, we don't know where she is. And I went, what do you mean? He said, she's vanished. All her stuff's there, all her credit cards and everything are all up in their room, but she's vanished.
Police scoured the church and grounds for evidence and began interviewing members of the community. They discovered that the last person seen with Angelica was the church handyman, a man named Pat McLaughlin. Charity worker Dennis provided police with a photograph of McLaughlin.
At 6 o'clock it went in the evening news nationwide, and within minutes their phone line was jammed to say, that's not Pat McLaughlin, that's Peter Tobin.
Police now had their main suspect. They quickly discovered that Tobin had a violent past, and the investigation escalated at rapid speed. David Swindle was the lead detective on the case.
I became involved in the investigation when it was established that Peter Tobin, a missing sex offender, had been with Angelica Cluk. And soon after my involvement, I arranged for the church to be searched again by specialist officers and specialist teams. There's a garage attached to the church, and that is where Peter Tobin was with Angelica Cluk, working on some woodwork. He called her his little apprentice. He actually was interviewed by a police officer when the missing person report was made, and he stayed there for another day, and when the heat was on, he left. When he realised it was being treated as a major investigation, he left. This is someone that was cool and calculated.
Police launched a nationwide search for Peter Tobin.
Mr. Tobin is considered a potential risk to members of the public. Any person who sees this man is advised not to approach him.
It was a name that sounded all too familiar to crime journalist Martin Brunt.
It was a shock to find what had happened, but what made it particularly interesting for crime reporters who were covering the case was that police were appealing for a man called Peter Tobin, and it rang bells. It took me and others back to the days of 1993. They didn't realise that he was, in reality, Peter Tobin with a dreadful history of sex crimes. He was a man hiding in that community under a false name, had duped the church authorities to employ him as a handyman, and of course they were completely innocent of his background.
As the search for Angelica intensified, it became more and more likely she wouldn't be found alive.
We had another search of the church, a really thorough search, because by this time the parameters had changed. There was concern for her safety.
5 days after her disappearance, on the 29th of September 2006, police discovered the body of Angelica Cluk under the floorboards of St Patrick's Church. She'd suffered severe head injuries and multiple stab wounds after being attacked in the adjoining garage.
It was in there just after the priest, Father Jerry, left on that Sunday. Within minutes of it, someone across the road had heard a scream. He hit her over the head with a table leg. There was splinters in her head, rendered her unconscious or semi-conscious, bound her hands with cable ties, further assaulted her, dragged her in a polythene sheet into the church here and across the church, and put her body under the floor like a bag of rubbish. She was put under there. He stabbed her, whether that happened underneath there or whether it happened outside, and he raped her. He left her dead.
The British public was shocked to learn the truth of where Angelica's body had been hidden since her violent death.
This should have been a day of worship here at St Patrick's Church, but instead the building remains a crime scene, sealed off and guarded by police. And today brought the news that the people who laid those floral tributes were expecting but dreading that the body found hidden underneath the floorboards here was indeed that of the missing Polish student.
I think the discovery of Angelica's body was awful enough that a young woman had died in those circumstances, the fact that she was buried under a church added some sense of horror and drama to the way people reacted to it. The fact that a suspect was somebody who had been working at the church, somebody who seemingly had volunteered to be a handyman at the church, didn't really make sense.
DNA evidence on Angelica's body was confirmed as belonging to Peter Tobin, and his fingerprints were found on the tarpaulin he used to wrap her in.
In forensic pathology, we have what's called Locard's exchange principle. That says that when you interact with another person, you leave something of yourself on them and you take something of them away with you. Anyone who murders another person, who physically interacts with them, they will leave trace evidence. They will leave DNA, potentially fibres, hairs, all sorts of things.
But Peter Tobin continued to elude the authorities. Despite a nationwide search, he disappeared into thin air.
So things were moving very fast. We have the human remains of a young woman who's been ferociously attacked. Horrible, horrible scene underneath the floorboards. Forensic examination is ongoing. We knew by this time that Peter Tobin had a history of violence, sexual crimes. He had been in prison. He was a dangerous person. Where was he?
David and his team wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. In early October, just over a week since Angelica's murder, they received a crucial breakthrough. Tobin had been spotted, this time using another alias, James Kelly, over 400 miles away.
We got a phone call from the police in London that he had checked into a hospital in a false name. Someone had recognised him. A Metropolitan police officer went in there and confirmed his identity. And I arranged for a team of uniform officers to bring him back to Scotland.
On the 23rd of March 2007, the trial of 60-year-old Peter Tobin began at Edinburgh High Court. He was charged with the rape and murder of 23-year-old student Angelica Cluk. Tobin pleaded not guilty and remained brazen throughout.
Went into court, he was sitting with his lawyer and he gave me a big smile, as if, "How you doing, pal, you know?" I just totally ignored it.
6 weeks later, on the 4th of May 2007, the jury took just 4 hours to deliberate and Peter Tobin was found guilty. Judge Lord Menzies described him as an evil man before sentencing him to serve a minimum of 21 years. He was immediately sent to Edinburgh prison. As he left court, he violently lashed out at photographers. But David Swindle and his team were convinced there was still more to the Tobin story. Throughout the trial, they'd been building a massive dossier on Tobin's past.
Do you get to 60 and you start killing? That was a question in my mind. Has this individual done it before? So I thought, we need to look at this individual's movements, his background, look back at his life. However, this was a difficult thing, because if it ever got out that we were looking at Peter Tobin as a potential serial killer, that would have been prejudicial to the case that we're building regarding Angelica. So I set up a very confidential operation called Operation Anagram, and that was working in a back room, and we never went out in the public regarding that until he was convicted of the murder of Angelica Cluk.
The police faced an almost impossible task, tracing backwards from the culprit to the victims.
It is very difficult to analyse cold cases with really only rumour to go on. If you don't have a body or bodies, if you don't know who the victims were, if they could have been missing persons or they could have been victims, it's very difficult.
There was a team of officers that had sent out to look at his connections and where he lived, and they came in excited saying, he's got an address in Bathgate. And the address in Bathgate was at the same time as a well-known missing person who'd been so many years ago, Vicky Hamilton.
15-year-old Vicky Hamilton had been last seen on the 10th of February 1991 waiting for a bus home to Reading near Falkirk. Her case was considered to be one of Scotland's biggest missing persons inquiries.
What are the chances of an individual like that being in the same area at the same time when this really high-profile missing person had disappeared? So I contacted Lothian and Borders Police, and they started looking at the case again and reviewing that case.
In June 2007, police began to search Tobin's former home.
As soon as he was convicted for the murder of Angelica Cluk, they went overt and they searched the house at Robertson Avenue in Bathgate, and they found potential evidence it could link. It was a knife, a dagger.
But there was no evidence of a body or human remains. David Swindle and his team needed to look further afield for the answers they wanted.
Anagram was about where Tobin was, what happened in an area, what the victim, the person that disappeared, looked like. Was it his type of victim? Were they vulnerable in any way at that time? I called it investigative analysis of a serial killer.
Tobin's transient lifestyle made it very difficult for the team to work alone on the operation.
Tobin had spent his whole life travelling about, and we found this out very quickly. So we had one connection, which was Bathgate. We realised that he spent a lot of time in Brighton and Margate. I thought, we need to join this up. So Anagram became UK-wide, and it involved every single police force in the UK. And we set up this operation, which is the best example of joined-up working throughout the UK.
David's team began to uncover more potential victims.
We had another missing person that was a potential link, and that was Dinah McNichol. Dinah had been at the Lip Hook Festival, and she had been with her then boyfriend, and they were looking for a lift, and they got a lift from an individual, a Scottish individual.
But after the mysterious driver dropped off her boyfriend in Surrey, 18-year-old Dinah never made it home to Essex. She was last seen in early August 1991.
I think Peter Tobin is quite an opportunistic offender in that he will identify a victim and then he will pounce. He's like a predator. But all of the time that this is going on, he's developing his offending. He's very reliant on this superficial charm that he's developed and that he rolls out whenever he identifies a victim. So whether it's a hitchhiker that he picks up on the road, whether it's somebody who works at the same location as he does, he will deploy this charm, and this will essentially lead his victims to let their guard down.
Police focused in on one of Tobin's previous homes in Margate, 50 Irvine Drive, where he'd lived in 1991. His former neighbour, Dave Martin, remembers the day the police knocked on his door.
The police turned up in November 2007 and they asked to speak about Peter Tobin. So I told them what little I knew at the time, and then they said something rather strange, had he done any gardening? Well, it made me smile at the time because that's the last thing I've ever seen him do, gardening. Then I remembered the sandpit.
Dave cast his mind back 16 years.
I noticed that Peter was digging a hole next door, so I leant over the fence and I said, "You going for Australia, Pete?" Because the hole did seem to be a bit deep. "Oh," he said, "I'm building a sandpit for my youngster when he comes up at the weekends." So anyway, I thought no more of it and he carried on. A couple of days later, I looked over again and the sandpit was all filled in. So next time I saw him, I said, "What happened to your sandpit, Pete?" "Oh," he said, I wasn't allowed to put one in. It's something to do with regulations. It was unsafe for the boy." So I said, "Well, I haven't heard of that one," but I thought no more of it at the time.
It was exactly what the police had been hoping to hear. Was it possible that for the last 16 years, the bodies of both Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol had been buried in the back garden of 50 Irvine Drive? On November the 12th, Tim Mills, the senior investigating officer on the Dinah McNichol case, made the decision to excavate the garden at Tobin's former home in Irvine Drive, Margate, convinced he would discover her body. Specialist equipment, including ground-penetrating radar, was brought in as police underwent their search.
People tend to think that these crimes are committed in very different locations. This was a very mundane, matter-of-fact, terraced house on an estate in Margate.
It took just 24 hours before the police found human remains.
I can remember to this day what I was doing when I got a telephone call from Tim Mills to say that I had found a body in the garden. I asked him, was it Dinah McNichol? And he says, no, it's Vicky Hamilton.
Operation Anagram had uncovered exactly what they'd hoped, but also dreaded to find. For Vicky's family, a 16-year wait had been brought to a devastating end in a back garden over 450 miles from where she'd last been seen.
Peter Tobin will have walked this path. It leads to what was his backyard. There are police search teams there now and several large holes they've been digging. The blue tarpaulin covers the shallow grave where they found 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton's body.
When you learn that they'd made that kind of progress, you're filled with I suppose, a sense of sadness, perhaps relief for the families. And of course it threw up the prospect of another trial of Peter Tobin.
Tobin was immediately charged with Vicky Hamilton's murder, but the police had yet to finish their excavation of his former home.
We came here to search for the remains of Dinah McNichol or any physical evidence which might link her disappearance to that house, and that's what we will continue to do.
And they wouldn't have to wait long. On the 16th of November, a second body was found in the garden, which was indeed that of 18-year-old Dinah McNichol.
The two victims that were found were essentially skeletal remains. That causes a great deal of difficulty for the pathologists. Obviously, we have no skin to look at for bruises or stab wounds. We have no organs to look at for injury or disease. But if you do have two bodies clandestinely buried in the same place, it's certainly a very big indicator that these are not two natural deaths.
When they started to bring the bodies out, I was sick because I had no idea whatsoever that anything like that had gone on. Nobody had a clue that anything like that had gone on. It was just unbelievable.
Tobin's fingerprints were found on the bin bags used to wrap Dinah's body, and post-mortem examinations found traces of the drug amitriptyline in both Dinah and Vicky Hamilton, the same drug Tobin used on the two teenage girls he'd attacked in 1993.
One of the things that's always of value in a forensic pathological investigation is toxicology. Has this person taken drugs, either deliberately or by accident? Have they been sedated by somebody else? All of this can give you answers to things that have happened with them. And particularly if you have something like a sample of liver or muscle available, then if those drugs are in the system at the time somebody died, they will still be identifiable weeks, months, potentially even years later.
Tobin first stood trial for the murder of Vicky Hamilton on the 2nd of December 2008 at the High Court in Dundee. He was found guilty. Judge Lord Emsley added another 30 years to his sentence and told Tobin he considered his crimes the most evil and horrific acts that any human being could commit. 7 months later, on the 23rd of June 2009, Tobin was in court once more, charged with the murder of 18-year-old Dinah McNichol. But it was postponed and the jury discharged on the 7th of July, as the judge, Mr. Justice Calvert-Smith, ruled Tobin was not fit to stand trial due to ill health.
Peter Tobin has a habit of feigning illness all of the time, and it's quite obvious to me why he's doing this. As a psychopath, he likes playing with people, he likes pushing their buttons, he likes to be the puppet master that's pulling the strings. And he knows that when he claims that he has chest pains or he's having a heart attack, that prison authorities need to react to that, they need to respond. And I think he quite enjoys watching people running around after him and pandering to him. I think he finds it quite entertaining.
On the 14th of December, Tobin's trial for Dinah's murder resumed at Chelmsford Crown Court. William Clegg QC was prosecuting.
Well, all murder cases are traumatic for obvious reasons, but this one particularly so because the family had absolutely no idea what had happened to their child for nearly 20 years. So there was a great deal of emotional tension in court. The family were there throughout the trial and behaved with great dignity and composure throughout it.
During the trial, even more revelations came out about Tobin's callous nature.
She had been left some money by her mother, who had died prematurely, and there was some £2,000 of it in her account at the time of her death. After her murder, Tobin had withdrawn that money from a number of banks on the south coast, banks that were situated comparatively near to addresses that he had a connection with, and therefore there was yet a further connection.
Dave Martin took to the stand to testify against his former neighbour.
He was sticking his thumbs up and saying, "Are you okay, Dave? I haven't seen you a long time." Which was a little on the shocking side to me because I really didn't want to know him. It was as if he wasn't taking any of the proceedings seriously.
The defence offered no arguments against the evidence, and the trial lasted a mere 3 days. The jury deliberated for a brief 15 minutes before returning their decision. Tobin was guilty, yet again.
Well, to be honest, it was a very easy case to state. The evidence against him was overwhelming. One had to use just an element of common sense to appreciate what would be the chances of a stranger burying a body that they had presumably murdered in a random garden, selecting one that just happened to be one that another murderer had already buried somebody else.
On the 16th of December 2009, Judge Mr. Justice Calvert-Smith handed Tobin another life sentence, his third in total, with a recommendation that life means life. In July 2010, it was reported that officers working on Operation Anagram had narrowed their review down to 9 unsolved cases of murder and disappearance. Despite claiming to have killed more women, Tobin has so far refused to cooperate with the police.
Peter Tobin has no respect, a man of no humanity. He will talk. He's been interviewed by police officers involved in Anagram, but he'll talk about himself because this is an individual that loves himself. He doesn't care about anyone else. So he gets a gratification, whatever gratification he has had, killing people. He's a sad, sad individual who's taken probably more lives than we know.
What sets Tobin apart also for me is that he's taken some pride in gloating in the wake of his imprisonment that he's killed 48 women and then saying, but you've got to prove it. No proof of those extra killings has ever been brought forward, but a number of high-ranking officers, particularly in Scotland, are absolutely convinced that Tobin has killed many more women, but they don't know which ones and they don't know where.
In June 2011, the failure to identify more victims led to Operation Anagram being wound down.
I am proud of what I did as regards Peter Tobin and forming Operation Anagram, a search for the truth. I left the police in 2011, but I'll never forget that. I'll never forget the Tobin case. And in my mind, I always live in hope that we will find out the truth someday. That's why it's important that we have programmes like this. People like Tobin and other killers should never be forgotten about.
I think Peter Tobin definitely killed more people than he's been convicted of killing. Somebody like him doesn't just stop offending for any lengthy period of time. I think there are victims that we don't know about. I think he was incredibly careful with some of the people that he targeted.
Peter Tobin's crimes spread far and wide across the UK and left a lasting effect on the people he met.
Tobin is an evil man. He's got no respect, no compassion. Peter Tobin, the only thing he's worried about is Peter Tobin.
People say, you want him to die? I said, I don't want him to die. I want him to live a long time and every day be filled with fear, real fear. That's what I want for him. Because what he done to people is horrendous.
I think Peter Tobin is evil. Always was and always will be. And that's my honest opinion of it. And I think he's done more than people realise.
The sense that he knows something that the rest of us don't gives succour to Tobin's vast arrogance. But to be honest and to be clear, there is a level of depravity in him which I fear knows very, very few boundaries. He's genuinely terrifying man, and I hope that he spends the rest of his life firmly behind bars.
Peter Tobin is evil. He's horrible. 34 years in the police, I have never dealt with such an evil individual.
Tobin's insatiable need to cause pain and suffering knows no bounds. He's proved to be toxic to anyone he's met or any community he's entered. He is a dangerous sexual predator who callously ended the life of at least 3 young women. We may never know if there are more victims of Peter Tobin, but we can be sure that his lifelong incarceration means there will certainly be no more. The 19th of August 1987 was a warm summer's day in the idyllic market town of Hungerford in Berkshire, a town that truly encompasses the spirit of the British countryside.
Upright, calm, lovely high street, delicate shops. The epitome of a south of England, self-effacing and yet rather proud town.
But this rural idyll was about to become the setting for one of the worst mass shootings in British history, perpetrated by one lone individual.
When we look at spree killers, we look at what drives them. It's often an underlying simmering resentment that is often years in the making. It's a very unique form of mass murder.
A gun-obsessed local man named Michael Ryan had taken to the streets, firing randomly at strangers, intent on killing anyone who crossed his path.
People were deeply shocked at the way this chaotic violence had erupted into what were small-scale, placid English lives.
By killing 16 people in less than 2 hours, Michael Ryan had undoubtedly become one of the world's most evil killers. It was a day that shocked the nation. On Wednesday, August the 19th, 1987, a lone gunman took to the streets of the countryside town of Hungerford in Berkshire and terrorised the residents. Armed with a collection of deadly weapons, 27-year-old Michael Ryan began his rampage in nearby Savernake Forest by killing a young mother in front of her children. By the time Ryan turned the gun on himself just before 7 p.m, 14 people were dead. 2 others would later die in hospital.
There couldn't have been a more unlikely setting for the senseless carnage of August the 19th, 1987. To the townspeople of Hungerford, massacre was the sort of word used in history and fiction.
30 years later, in February 2017, a small number of the locals gathered to mark an event of great importance, but equally one they'd all rather forget.
Let's pray, shall we? We meet in the presence of God. We pray for all who in bereavement, disability or pain continue to suffer the consequences of the tragedy. We remember with thanksgiving and sorrow those whose lives have been taken away.
Hungerford resident and ex-policeman Trevor Wainwright lost his father during the tragedy.
The ceremony was really a rededication of the memorial plaque for those that were killed in the Hungerford tragedy. They put the plaque on the wall of the local football club, and it remained there for 20 years plus. And I think the local council thought that perhaps it wasn't the right place to have that plaque, and it might be more fitting to put it on the wall of the war memorial.
The tragedy was an event that affected the whole town, including former Mayor of Hungerford, Ron Terry.
I think it's important that we don't forget it. It is part of our history, whether we like it or not, and I think that it's important that we do remember it, and that tragedy memorial is the remembrance of what happened on that day.
Because of my involvement with my own family and being the local policeman, I've not wanted to forget what happened, but in my position, I like to think I sometimes represent the town to discuss these issues for them. It's very difficult. People in the town have always kept away from publicity, I suppose probably because of what happened on the day and the way the media invaded the town back in 1987.
The story of the Hungerford tragedy begins almost 60 years ago. Michael Ryan was born just 10 miles from Hungerford in Marlborough, Wiltshire, on the 18th of May 1960. His 55-year-old father, Alfred, was 20 years senior to Ryan's mother, Dorothy, who doted on their young son.
Michael was a bit of a mummy's boy. She really did pander to him and tended to insulate him quite a lot from the outside world. But I think in insulating him, she tended to isolate him a little bit as well. So he didn't really develop the skills of social interaction with his peers all that well.
Ryan was an only child who struggled to fit in with the other kids at school.
I think because he hadn't had those relationships with siblings that most children have, he found it difficult to relate to other people. So he didn't really make any connections with others at school. And I think he got a bit of a reputation as being the older one out, the slightly strange kid.
Age 16, Ryan left John O'Gaunt Secondary School and began his working career as a part-time handyman. His mother continued to dote on him, even as he grew older, reportedly buying him everything he wanted, including his first air rifle. He began a collection of firearms, which he kept on proud display in his room.
The Freudians would say that was a significant thing because of his own lack of masculinity and had to use a gun to confirm his own masculinity. Lived in a fantasy world of gun magazines and used to wear a strange kind of camouflage hat as though he was really Rambo. Some have speculated that he was spoiled, some that he was just overindulged. But there is no doubt that he turned into a tragic loner.
In 1985, 25-year-old Ryan lost his father to cancer and became even more withdrawn from the society around him. He immersed himself in his passion for guns, spending more and more time at the firing range.
Often when we look at spree killers, we look at what drives them. It's often an underlying simmering resentment that is often years in the making. And because they don't have those social connections with other people, they simmer away and they just get worse and worse, and they spend a lot of time on their own, ruminating and planning.
On the 19th of August 1987, the 27-year-old was unemployed and still living at home with his mother. The frustration simmering inside Michael Ryan was about to boil over.
No one can say whether he got out of bed that morning and decided, I think I'm going to shoot 16 people today. Though there can be no doubt that he took out 2 semi-automatic rifles and a Beretta handgun, and by 12:30 had killed his first victim.
Ryan had loaded his car with guns and driven out to Savernake Forest, 7 miles west of Hungerford. 35-year-old Susan Godfrey was picnicking there with her 2 young children.
Ryan approached Susan Godfrey and her 2 children, instructed her at gunpoint to put her children into the car, then took her into the bushes in the forest and shot her 13 times in the back.
Ryan had callously and brutally committed his first murder.
Indeed, it was her children who subsequently first raised the alarm when they told a passerby, "A man in black has shot our mummy."
Mrs. Myra Rose told for the first time how she was asked for help by two young children who'd just seen their mother shot dead.
And she said, "A man in black shot my mummy." I don't think they realised what death was.
But Ryan wasn't done for the day. Susan Godfrey was his first victim, but would not be his last.
He set off down the A4 towards Hungerford, stopped at a petrol station to fill up his car, waited for another car to leave, and then tried to kill the lady behind the counter.
From the forecourt, Ryan opened fire through the glass at the cashier as she ducked for cover. When he entered the shop to finish the job, his gun jammed and he fled. The fortunate woman immediately dialed 999 and alerted the police. Ryan got back into his car and continued on with his journey. His day of murder and destruction had begun, but he was nowhere near finished as he headed directly towards his hometown of Hungerford. At around 12:45, Ryan arrived home to number 4 South View.
We got there about 1:45 to load up the rest of his collection of guns into the back of his car. He duly did so, and then the car, for whatever reason, failed to start. Ryan was so furious, he shot the car 5 times. He then killed his dog, for reasons, again, no one can explain, set fire to the house, and he killed 2 neighbours who happened to be in their back garden.
Ryan's next-door neighbours, Roland and Sheila Mason, were both killed instantly. With his house in flames, 27-year-old Ryan took 3 guns from his car, a Beretta 9mm pistol, an M1 carbine assault rifle, and an AK-47 machine gun. He then headed east on foot.
He took 2 semi-automatics and a handgun with him and started to walk towards Hungerford Common. Then began what you could describe as almost a spree.
Ryan shot and injured 2 more people at the end of Southview, one of them a 14-year-old girl. He seemed intent on causing mayhem on the streets of the small rural town.
We will probably never know what Michael Ryan's intentions were when he left the house on the day that he carried out these killings. I think when we look at some of his behaviour around it, though, we can perhaps speculate that he was suffering from some kind of mental illness. Some of the things for me that would support that would be how close together these killings were. When killings are further apart, when there's time in between them, the person is thinking about it, the person is deciding to do it again. But when it's in a continuous spree like this, there's less of that decision-making going on, and psychosis or schizophrenia do come into the picture.
One of the injured women who Ryan had shot at through her living room window had managed to dial 999. Reports of the shootings had even filtered through to newsrooms across the country.
I was a general news reporter in the newsroom of the Times on the eastern side of London. And news came in, even in those days, news got around very quickly, that there'd been a major shooting incident in this small Berkshire country town of Hungerford. And I was sent by the office from London to Hungerford, which is about between 80 and 90 miles. And I was dispatched, I think, probably sometime after 1 o'clock. And I just shot down the M4.
News had also reached the mayor of Hungerford, Ron Tarry, who was at a meeting in a nearby village.
I was in the Lambourne area and I had the car radio on when I heard that there'd been a shooting in Hungerford. A number of people had been killed. My first thought was there are a number of Hungerfords. There's one down in Hampshire, and probably not ours. And then it said Hungerford is a small market town in Berkshire. Suddenly the shock came in. It was my Hungerford, if I like to call it that. How can it happen in a place like Hungerford?
At that point, I had an antique store in Hungerford. And so I knew the town really very well. I used to go there every week without fail, Saturday and Sunday. It was very comfortable and warm and an enjoyable place to be, which makes the juxtaposition with Ryan all the more dramatic. Because we're not talking about the mean streets of Chicago here. We're not talking about East Los Angeles. We're talking about Hungerford, a delightful, charming English county town with no real worries and equally no history of violence.
Ryan's spree continued. On a footpath that ran between Southview and Hungerford Common, he encountered a family walking the opposite way. While the rest of his family ran away, the 51-year-old father, Kenneth Clements, put his hands up as if to surrender, but Ryan cold-bloodedly shot him in the chest, killing him instantly. Kenneth had become Ryan's fourth victim.
There doesn't seem to be a pattern to Michael Ryan's behaviour on the day that he carries out these shootings. It appears to be indiscriminate. They are everyday people doing everyday normal things. And I think Michael Ryan never felt that he was part of that normal, part of that everyday. So perhaps there is a pattern underlying it in that the people that he's taking his rage out on are the people that he wants to be like.
Another Hungerford resident, police officer Trevor Wainwright, was out of town enjoying a day off when he heard the news.
On the 19th of August, I can remember very clearly, it was a beautiful hot summer's day. I heard that there'd been a shooting or a hold-up at a filling station at Savernake.
Because the reports from the petrol station were coming from the neighbouring county of Wiltshire, Trevor didn't draw any association to his own patch in Hungerford until he received a distressing call from home.
And it was my wife saying, "Trevor, you better get home. Don't know what's happening, but there's gunfire going across our garden." So I thought, oh, what's all that about? Could it be connected with the Savernake thing? You know, I didn't know. But obviously I'd like to get back to Hungerford.
As Trevor raced home, the true severity of the situation was revealed to him.
As I drove across Hungerford Common, I could see on the edge of the town a couple of houses on fire. You know, you could see the smoke. And I could see in a clump of trees there was a group of people shouting in the trees. So I pulled up and I knew a couple of people there. I said, what's going on? And they said, oh, there's a bloke gone mad with a gun. I just didn't know what to think, you know, and you could smell the cordite from the weapon in the air, which I've never experienced that before, not like that, you know, because you could hear the sound of a gun going off. But I think the smoke and the fire from the house was the thing that was quite frightening.
By now, police were beginning to arrive in Hungerford, still unaware of the scale of the ongoing devastation. Trevor's colleague, 41-year-old Roger Brereton, was the first constable on the scene at Southview.
Roger Brereton was a lovely lad. He was a local lad, I think came from Wantage way originally. He came to Hungerford as a PC. We used to go out, crew a car together on many occasions, going around the rural area. He was always a laugh and a joke. He was a good police officer. He was out in the Newbury area and the call came up, there was shooting in Hungerford. And bravely he said, I'm on my way.
But by now, Ryan had turned back towards his home and spotted Roger Brereton in his police car as he arrived.
He just went to do his job and drove up into Southview. And tragically, he was shot whilst he was in the car several times. And he didn't stand a chance.
Ryan fires 23 rounds at Brereton in his police car, hitting him 4 times. He was unarmed. He was doing no more than responding to a call that were reports of gunfire. How could he possibly have expected to encounter a man who would shoot at him 23 times?
It could have been anyone, you know, but, you know, it was pretty tough. It was him.
PC Roger Brereton had become Ryan's 5th victim of the day.
I mean, nowadays, you know, we're used to this as an age of terrorist attacks. They'd be armed to the teeth, the people who were... But they were just policemen. They didn't carry sidearms, they didn't have rifles. So if Michael Ryan had wanted, he could have gone due west, and he could have gone into Hungerford High Street, and he could have gone up and down the High Street, shooting people left, right and centre, and no one could have stopped him, because there was no policeman with any weapon.
Town Mayor Ron Talley was desperately trying to return to his home and find out if his family was safe, but the increased number of police had made that difficult.
Well, I drove to Hungerford. Everything was closed off. The police were on every entry into Hungerford, and there's no way I could get into Hungerford. My wife was here, and my daughter and grandson were here. But I went just out of town to a farm manager that I knew and was able to ring and speak to my wife here and be assured that they were all okay. And that was the first concern, but I couldn't get into Hungerford till some time.
With Hungerford in lockdown, Ryan continued with his bloody spree on Southview, shooting at passing cars. First he fired at a mother and her daughter, who managed to escape by driving away. Then he shot and killed driver George White and another neighbour, 84-year-old Abdul Khan, who was in the back garden of his home on Fairview Road.
He shoots at a neighbour, he shoots at an ambulance, which has also responded to the concept of shots fired. The man dissembling, disintegrating before your very eyes, falling apart, shooting at people entirely at random. And then, of all remarkable coincidences, his mother drives into the Southview.
Ryan's mother, Dorothy, arrived to a scene of complete devastation.
It's almost impossible to imagine what she must have thought. Her house is on fire, there are bodies in the road, her neighbours are dead, and there's her son carrying 2 rifles and a handgun, clearly having done something absolutely terrifying. His mother gets out of the car, puts her hands up, and pleads with him. Ryan shoots her, kills her.
It could be theorised that he accidentally shot his mother. I mean, if he was experiencing some kind of psychosis, some kind of mental health condition where he wasn't in control of his actions, he could well have just been targeting people randomly, people who appeared in his line of sight, and his mother happened to be one of those people.
As this scene of absolute tragedy and terror continued to unfold on Southview, Trevor Wainwright reported for duty at Hungerford Police Station.
It was quite bedlam, to be honest. In those days, we only had 2 phone lines into the police station, and there was a lot of movement. The first thing I wanted to know is who this was that was shooting people. Because, you know, I'd been at Hungerford as a bobby 15 years. I knew all the kids. I played football with them. I took them for football. And I had a wonderful relationship with people in the town. And this name, Michael Ryan, came out, and it didn't mean anything to me. I thought, well, who the hell's that?
At 1:30 p.m, the specially trained tactical firearms unit were brought in to support the local police.
Yeah, the adrenaline was running through me, and I knew what I wanted to do was to accompany the armed police when they arrived, because I was the local bobby, you know, and I thought, well, they didn't know where he was, you know, the location of him at that time. And so I said, well, I'll go down to the newsagents and get local maps and Ordnance Survey maps. I drove my car down into the high street, and I was amazed to see a row of ambulances, a PC who stopped the traffic, and a couple of fire engines, more police cars, and there was people sheltering in shop doorways. I just went straight into the newsagents. I said, let me have your street maps, let me have all the maps you've got. So I was able to get some, grabbed them, drove back to the police station, and by that time there was lots of senior police officers coming in and armed response vehicles that were coming in.
We knew something pretty serious was going on, but we didn't really know the scale of it. The telephone system was overwhelmed. I think it was very difficult for the police to find out where he was and what he'd done.
Even with the help of the maps, the police were struggling to locate Ryan.
At that time, there was conflicting reports as to his exact location because of the communication problem with the phones. Calls were coming in saying he was in one street, but of course he'd moved on by the time that call had been processed. So nobody knew where he was, but all the time he was shooting people as he went round the streets.
Ryan was on the move. After wounding another of his neighbours on Clark's Gardens, he'd headed back across Hungerford Common, where he murdered Francis Butler, a young father who was walking his dog. His 10th victim of the day was taxi driver Marcus Barnard, whom he gunned down on Bullpit Lane. But Ryan wasn't nearly finished. He was heading towards the heavily populated town centre. On Priory Avenue, he'd shot and injured 2 more people before heading north towards Fairview Road.
As he walked along, he was shooting at pretty much anyone he came across. Some he killed, some he simply injured.
Local police officer Trevor Wainwright was in the midst of working to bring Ryan's killing spree to an end when tragedy struck, devastatingly close to home.
I got called into the sergeant's office and he said to me, Trevor, I don't know how to tell you this. I said, what? He said, your dad's been shot and he's dead.
Trevor's parents, Douglas and Kathleen Wainwright, were in their car just where Fairview Road meets Priory Avenue, unaware of the danger that awaited them as they drove to see their son.
I didn't even think about my mum and dad coming to Hungerford that day. They lived in Kent and they travelled, 120 miles that day. And they've driven 300 yards from my house and they drove straight into Michael Ryan, who shoots into the car. And he shot my dad in the head and he died instantly.
Kathleen was able to pull herself out of the car where she hid from Ryan until a local resident bravely took her into the safety of their home.
The sergeant told me my dad had died. At that point, he said, your mum's also been shot, but she's been taken to hospital. We're going to get you to the hospital. So it's really, that was me out of doing any more work at Hungerford.
By now, more and more journalists were arriving at the police cordons, desperate to find out exactly what was going on in the town.
You couldn't get into the town centre, but you could see there was a police helicopter overhead, and there was smoke in the distance as I checked in with the office. And they told me that there had been multiple shootings, and they knew even then that it was in this street called South View, which was on the eastern side of the town, and they wanted me, obviously, to get there as soon as I could, but you couldn't get within half a mile of it. I mean, there was no way on earth you could get anywhere near it at that time.
It soon became apparent to the press that something horrifying was happening within the town, but no one was really sure just what was going on.
Even the police didn't know what had happened. The whole incident consisted of 3 locations. 10 miles away in Savanack Forest, it all began when he shot that poor woman who was picnicking with her children. Then he drove down the A4 to Froxfield, where the service area was, and he tried to shoot the woman on the till. And then he came into Hungerford. And gradually these reports of these different things came in, and it was immensely confusing. And if it was confusing for the police, it was doubly confusing for journalists who were trying to put together a picture of what had happened.
Gradually, Mike and his fellow journalists began to build a bigger picture.
It was starting to become clear that there was a man on the loose with what looked like automatic weapons who had killed more than one person. There were perhaps 2, 3, 4, even 5 people dead. He was just shooting with a fully automatic assault rifle. So, piecing that together for the police, never mind for journalists, was a very difficult task to do.
But the media and the police had no idea of just how much the body count was rising. Van driver Eric Vardy became Ryan's 12th victim of the day when he was shot on the junction of Priory Avenue and Tarrants Hill. The gunman then crossed through Orchard Park Close, killing 22-year-old Sandra Hill in her passing car. After heading onto Priory Road, Ryan forced his way into a house and killed both Victor Gibbs and his wife Myrtle, bringing his tally of victims to 15.
Most spree killers feel kind of quite hard done by. They feel that they are victims. They feel that other people have been out to get them for their entire lives. And they often begin fantasizing about one day getting their revenge on these people.
Ryan continued south on Priory Road, now heading away from the town centre and towards his old school, John O'Gaunt. He shot at a family who were driving by in their car. 34-year-old father Ian Plale was hit in the neck and died. In less than 90 minutes, Ryan had killed 16 people.
Finally, Ryan, I think symbolically, returns to his old school, the John O'Gaunt Community College, and he locks himself in. By this time, the police have managed to assemble a reaction, and he begins to negotiate.
For 5 hours, the police tried convincing Ryan to give himself up.
He seems incredibly concerned about his mother. That seems to be what is at the forefront of his mind, what he's most concerned with. And you could interpret that as some kind of remorse, but actually I think it's more indicative of his enmeshment with his mother and his dependence upon his mother, because they had quite an intense relationship. He really was quite a mummy's boy, and I think that the thought that he had killed her and taken her out of the equation was something that he was having quite a lot of trouble with.
Very near the end of the events at Hungerford that day, he said to the police negotiators, "Hungerford must be a bit of a mess by now. I wish I'd stayed in bed." And that, in a way, encapsulates the tragedy of him.
Shortly before 7 p.m, police heard a single shot emerge from the school.
The standoff ends with Ryan killing himself. The psychotic break is complete. He doesn't do anything dramatic. He simply shoots himself with one of his own rifles.
Sergeant Paul Brightwell of the Tactical Firearms Unit began a shouted conversation with him.
On many occasions, he seemed to me just to be on the verge of coming out. It wasn't until he said about the fact that he'd got 1 round of ammunition left. And I sort of said, well, why have you kept that one? And he said, it's obvious.
In a way, it was a sort of something of relief. Then it was over then, you know, he couldn't shoot anyone else, and in a way, it sort of was brought some closure in my mind. It didn't bring any closure to the events that happened subsequently, but it did bring closure to that event. He couldn't shoot any more else, and no more lives would be lost.
For the local residents, including Trevor Wainwright, the news of Ryan's suicide brought mixed feelings.
One of the strangest things for me was that the remorse had gone, you know, the fact that he'd killed himself and he was no longer alive. The hatred, you know, if he'd have been caught and arrested, I would have hated him so much, and I would have been at every court hearing to see him get sentenced. But the fact that he killed himself, I didn't have that hatred.
In the wake of the tragedy, the news began to spread of the true loss of life in Hungerford.
In the evening, we were told there'd be a briefing by the head of Thames Valley Police. And it was about 8:10 in the evening, and there were about 20 of us there. We were waiting just at the corner of this lane, I remember. And this senior officer came down. And remember, we all thought, you know, we knew that more than one person was dead. It could be 3, 4, 5, even 6. It was an enormous shock. No one had any idea of the scale of it until that moment. And that was the first time we had a death toll, an accurate casualty figure.
16 people were dead. As the news became public, the face of the killer, Michael Ryan, began to circulate.
When I saw the picture of Ryan in the papers myself, I knew it was the guy I used to see walking his dogs on Hungerford Common in his combat jacket and his hat, but that wasn't anything alarming to me, because a lot of people wear those type of coats, you know, especially around this area. He was a guy that was quite insignificant, to be honest. He was quite polite. When I saw him on the common with his dogs, we'd say good morning, but his dogs would sniff each other, and he'd walk off.
I'd never really met him. I knew of him. I mean, he lived locally, and I saw Michael Ryan spectating at football matches, but didn't ever seem to mingle, and I didn't really know him at all. In fact, when I talked to people since, I don't think anybody really knew him.
When we look at people like Michael Ryan, people who carry out spree killings, the word loner often comes up. They tend to be very much kind of on their own, these lone wolves. And that's quite important for me, because I think when we have other people around us, they act as a bit of a check on our behaviour, a kind of surveillance. And when we say things that are a bit out of order, you know, our friends and our peers will often pull us up on that. When we don't have those connections, those feelings tend to escalate, and we tend to ruminate over feelings for quite a while. And without that filter, I think people like Michael Ryan can escalate quite quickly.
In the immediate aftermath, Hungerford proved itself to be a true community, pulling together to support those affected the most.
Meanwhile, the mayor launched an appeal for a fund for the survivors and relatives of the victims from the steps of the town hall.
The appeal is to be called the Hungerford Tragedy Fund. The community reaction was marvellous. It was remarkable. I mean, people said, what can I do? It's our problem. What can we do to help?
The vicar held a church service the first thing the next morning, which I went to. I think it was 8 o'clock in the morning. And he was very active in bringing people together. It was a community town. I mean, it was a sort of place where everybody knew everybody. And they did rally round.
In all that carnage, it seemed almost a cruel irony to proclaim God's love. Yet by prayer and word and deed, so many people were the instruments of God's love.
That was the great thing, the community spirit of the town, you know, and I think that's remained ever since.
After Michael Ryan's killing spree at Hungerford on August the 19th, 1987, the whole world was coming to terms with the events of the day. None more so than the residents of the town itself, where 16 people had died and a further 15 had been left injured.
Well, it was silent. My mother was alive then, and she lived just off Priory Avenue, not far from where the shooting took place, and I walked up there in the evening to ensure she was okay, and there wasn't a soul about. People were just shocked and just remained at home. Somebody told me after there's a report that people in Hungerford were cheering and singing because they heard that Michael Ryan had been killed, but it was absolute nonsense. But people were absolutely shocked and couldn't believe what had happened, and nor could I, for that matter.
Everyone wanted to know more about the mysterious gunman, and the media put a lot of unwanted attention on the small market town.
It became quite hard to talk to people because there were so many journalists there. As you can imagine, people got sick of it. Some of the tabloids would have had teams of 5 or 6. So you've got 40 or 50 journalists crawling over the place, and it can't be avoided. It's just part of life, but people didn't like it.
One news report in particular left Trevor Wainwright completely stunned.
Probably the thing that upset me really badly was the press coverage. The headlines were, PC signed father's own death warrant.
The headline in question referred to the unfortunate coincidence that Trevor had been the officer who helped approve Michael Ryan's gun licence renewal just weeks before the bloodbath.
I read that and I just couldn't believe that. And it meant to me that if I signed my dad's death warrant, then I signed the death warrants of all the other people that got shot. And to me, that was so unfair because Ryan was a member of a gun club. He had several weapons, and each time you have a weapon, you have to be vetted or have the licence amended and approved. If he wasn't a suitable person, I'd be the person able to say that. But because he had no record and nobody really knew him, although he was a local lad, he was a loner, that doesn't prevent you from having a firearms certificate. And, you know, clearly there was no reason for him not to have a firearms certificate.
Trevor was badly affected by the allegations and wanted to lay low for a while.
I was so upset that I didn't want to go to hospital to see my mum because she was in a ward with the other people that had been shot. And I couldn't face them. They obviously saw the paper in hospital. My mum was told that, I was very upset, and she phoned me up from hospital and she said, Trevor, get your arse in here. The people want you.
The Hungerford tragedy would in fact lead to calls to make drastic changes to the firearm laws in the UK.
As a direct result of the Hungerford massacre, the Home Secretary aired his new gun law proposals today. If Parliament agrees, then semi-automatic rifles like the AK-47, similar to Michael Ryan's murder weapon, will be banned.
What's the worst invention of the 20th century? It's the AK-47. Because it has 9 moving parts, it can be mended in a village workshop, and it enables a boy of 10 to kill 30 men. An AK-47 is a terrible weapon, and Ryan had one. And he also had an M1 carbine, which was American. So he had these assault rifles, which can, you know, go through a wall half a mile away.
So many people thought something's got to be done about this. Why on earth does a man need these guns, and why on earth is it necessary to license them?
What the government decided to do, very quickly, in short order, I think Douglas Hurd was the Home Secretary, they commissioned a report about this from the head of Thames Valley Police, which came in quite quickly, and as a result of it, they amended the Firearms Act. You could not any longer be in possession of a fully automatic assault weapon, and that was done really quite quickly.
The Home Secretary told senior officers in Torquay that the fearful events of Hungerford had added impetus to plans to tighten firearms legislation.
I have concluded that there can be no justification for high-powered self-loading rifles of the type used by Michael Ryan to be held by private individuals.
The Firearms Amendment Act, passed in 1988, banned the ownership of semi-automatic centre-fire rifles and restricted the use of shotguns with a capacity of more than 3 cartridges, in the hope that such a tragedy would never be repeated. For the people of Hungerford, it was little consolation. The hurt remains in the hearts of those who remember the 19th of August 1987 so vividly.
The scars linger now, 30 years on, because how could they not? Entirely random neighbours were killed, people you knew, people your children had been at school with, someone who might have seen every day at church. It was a community, and there's no way a community could have suffered such a trauma without having been dreadfully affected.
The press asked me, when was the last murder in Hungerford, do you think? And there were 2 policemen murdered in Hungerford in 1876. And I said, well, I think 111 years ago. I don't know anyone since then. It's not the sort of thing you'd expect to hear in a place like Hungerford.
I think the community has got stronger as a result of what's happened, and as time goes on, you know, the Hungerford thing fades out a little bit, but it will always be there.
To help support his family, Trevor's mother moved to Hungerford after the attacks to be closer to her son.
I was so pleased for her, you know, because she was brave enough to come here, you know, where other people were moving out. My mum lived here for another 15 years before she died, and at her funeral, the church was packed with local townspeople. And it was unbelievable, really, that the love they gave to her.
Michael Ryan's actions on that fateful day in August 1987 left the entire nation in complete shock. The pointless and random killings left many people asking, why?
One of the mysteries of Michael Ryan is that we will never know. He killed himself at the end of the events and killed his mother as part of the killings. There was no one else. His father had long since died. There were no siblings. There was no other close related family. He was, in the end, just this rather isolated, whey-faced young man with a fascination with guns.
I think Michael Ryan certainly did some evil things. Whether he consciously chose to do what he did, or whether he felt compelled to act in that way because of some kind of psychosis, perhaps we'll never know.
But the people of Hungerford refused to be defined by a day that caused so much pain and suffering in such a short space of time.
I think it strengthened community spirit. It made Hungerford better known for all the wrong reasons. Hungerford was more than that. That was just one dreadful day, but there's been hundreds of years of history when that wasn't Hungerford. And so we don't think of Michael Ryan and that day in August 1987 as being what Hungerford's about.
Ryan acted without reason and entirely at random. In less than 2 hours, he murdered 16 people, including a policeman and even his own mother. We may never know why he did what he did, But what we can say for certain is that the small community living in Hungerford refused to be beaten by his cruelty or haunted by the nightmare of Michael Ryan's deranged killing spree. In April 1991, doctors at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in Lincolnshire were perplexed. In just 2 months, the health of 13 children on Ward 4 had mysteriously deteriorated. 4 of them had died.
Sadly, I had to share with the parents and said, look, this is impossible, but I can't do anything more. I felt so sad. He died in my hands.
But this was no unfortunate coincidence.
I began to realise that there was a serial killer that was working on that ward and was causing the collapses of these children.
Unbelievably, one of the nurses was deliberately attempting to kill her young patients by injecting them with deadly poison.
The sergeant walked in and then he said, we have reason to believe that Paul's illness, hypoglycemic attacks, were a result of a maladministration of drugs. And I remember my words exactly. That would explain a lot, wouldn't it?
Beverly Allitt, the woman dubbed the Angel of Death, had without doubt become one of the world's most evil killers. It was a case that shocked the world. For 59 days in 1991, there was a serial killer stalking the children's ward at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in Lincolnshire. But nobody knew it. 22-year-old nurse Beverly Allitt's job was to protect the children in her care, but she abused her role. She was purposely harming them. Her crimes were horrific and ruined the lives of many, including the families of her innocent victims.
As a judge said to take her down, there were emotional scenes in the public gallery with families bursting into tears. One woman jumped up shouting, "Bastard, bastard." Another shouted, "Lock her in a cage."
Beverly Allitt had tried to get away with murder. Her story begins over 2 decades earlier. Beverly Allitt was born on the 4th of October 1968 in the small Lincolnshire village of Corby Glen. She was one of 4 children.
There don't seem to be any real red flags in Beverly Allitt's background that would suggest that she'd go on to do the things she did. So normally when we have a serial killer, we have an abusive or a violent childhood. There's something that's there in the background, but with Beverly Allitt, there doesn't seem to be any real powerful explanatory factor.
Fast forward to April 1991. 22-year-old Beverly Allitt had been working on the children's ward at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital for 3 months. One of the consultants on Ward 4 was Dr. Charith Nanayakara.
My first impressions about Beverly Allitt was nothing outstanding. She was just another quiet, pleasant, obliging nurse who was available.
During Allitt's short time on the ward, 3 children had died suddenly, and a further 9 had fallen seriously ill under suspicious circumstances. On April the 22nd, 1991, Beverly Allitt was on duty when 15-month-old Claire Peck was admitted to Ward 4. She was under the care of the 2 consultants at the hospital, Dr. Frederick Porter and Dr. Nanayakara.
Claire Peck, she had come with a severe attack of asthma, breathing difficulties, requiring oxygen. So Dr. Porter was called and he had come. He had tried to resuscitate and provide all the necessary care as appropriate. And Beverly Allitt on this occasion had been with him. In spite of all the efforts taken, Dr. Porter couldn't resuscitate her and she had died within hours.
Claire Peck was the 4th child to die unexpectedly at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in 3 months. It was an alarming number in such a short space of time.
I said, I really don't know what's going on, and got together with Dr. Porter and the senior nursing manager and checked through all the cases of worrying suspicions and anxieties we had. I compiled a report and sent it to unit general manager saying, we have series of these unexplained and sometimes explained collapses. We are very worried about these problems, and therefore we want to bring it to your notice. We need your help.
On the 30th of April, the hospital decided to ask the police to investigate the deaths to see if there could be something or someone casting a shadow over Ward 4. The case found its way to Chief Superintendent Stuart Clifton.
One of my detective sergeants at Grantham contacted me to say that he'd had a call from Grantham Hospital which suggested that they'd had a high number of collapses of children which may or may not be down to some criminal act. When I use the term collapsed, I'm talking in terms of each of them having stopped breathing, and the resuscitation team, known colloquially as the crash team, were called to resuscitate the children. There were two paediatricians employed at the hospital, Dr. Porter and Dr. Nanyakara, who had differing opinions about whether the collapses of children at that hospital over a period of about 3 months were actually medically related or whether they were at the hands of somebody who was causing those collapses.
After a meeting between detectives and doctors on the 3rd of May, it was decided they'd ask Professor David Hull, an expert in paediatrics, to give his insight on each of the cases.
He set out in some detail his findings, but concluded by saying, of the 13 children that I've looked at, I think that there are only 3 that are worthy of further investigation. In 2 of these cases, I feel that there will be a medical explanation, and in one case, a little boy called Paul Crampton, I think it's worthy of further investigation.
5-month-old Paul Crampton had been admitted to Ward 4 on the 20th of March 1991 with a chest infection. His dad, David, remembers it well.
Paul was actually born with measles, and he was taken home, and then after a relatively short period, a few months, Kath took him to the doctors, my wife, and he had a wheeze. They were, I think, overcautious, but that's the right thing with a child of that age, and they took him into hospital.
The first 3 days of his care were completely unremarkable, and he was expected to go home on that 3rd day. During the course of that day, Beverly Allitt brought to the attention of other nurses the fact that this little boy was having difficulty breathing.
I walked into a scene I did not expect, and that was Paul in the arms of a nurse, I think, at that particular time. He was cold, clammy, grey. And I recall that Nurse Beverly Allitt was there, and she said at the time, this child is hypoglycemic. The doctor had been called, the doctor came, and Paul was taken into the treatment room, and he disappeared for what seemed to be an eternity before we were allowed into the treatment room. And I remember Paul sat there playing with his toes. He seemed to have made a total recovery.
The following day, which was a Sunday, Beverly Allitt went to take the drip down, and within the space of a few minutes, the boy was once again hypoglycemic.
So obviously that was quite frightening. So we went within a very short space of time from a child that's coming home to a child that's now seriously ill, and without too much explanation.
3 days later, this little boy is expected to go home that day because he's continued to recover from his attacks. At about 10 minutes to 12, the boy's father goes up to the hospital canteen to get himself a sandwich, and when he returns some 20 minutes or so later, he finds a little boy that is grey, arched back, and clearly in some form of distress.
Call came from the ward that Paul had collapsed again, and my colleague rushed through, and when he saw his collapse, he immediately called the team from Nottingham and transferred him.
He went in the ambulance, both with my wife and with A doctor and nurse Beverly Allitt went in the ambulance with him. I remember walking into the ward at Queen's Medical Centre and it was just a totally different atmosphere. Calm, relaxed. Paul was in intensive care, but I just got the feeling that he was just going to get better. And he did.
Transferring Paul Crampton to Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham had saved his life. Tests revealed the insulin in his blood, which is usually between 4 and 6 milliunits per litre, was alarmingly high.
Dr. Porter had taken blood which had been sent to the University Hospital at Cardiff for examination. The insulin in the blood of Paul Crampton at 47,000 is the second highest ever recorded in the world.
He was fortunate enough to survive, and it was felt that he had abnormal external insulin being administered.
I think when we got the blood results, I began to realise that there was a serial killer that was working on that ward and was causing the collapses of these children.
I had a phone call from Crampton Police, and it was, "We'd like to come and see you. I won't tell you what it is, but we'll come and see you tomorrow." So I had an officer in Crampton at the time, and a sergeant walked in, and then he said, "We have reason to believe that Paul's illness, hypoglycemic attacks, were a result of maladministration of drugs." And I remember my words exactly. That would explain a lot, wouldn't it?
It was unthinkable. Was someone at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital murdering helpless children? The police had to investigate each of the cases to try and find the killer. They would begin with 7-week-old Liam Taylor, who was admitted on the 21st of February 1991, just 2 days after nurse Beverly Allitt had begun working on Ward 4. They had to tread carefully.
In a healthcare setting, it is very difficult to investigate a murder or a suspected murder because all of the individuals on that ward have a legitimate reason to be there. They have the access to the victim anyway. And often it's very difficult to prove that direct link between one particular member of staff and one particular victim. So the police have got a really, really difficult job on their hands when they're investigating this type of crime.
And it wasn't going to get any easier.
About a week or so into the inquiry, the whole investigation was blown by the local paper. And of course, then the world's press descended on Grantham.
Local radio reporter Sean Dunderdale was one of the first journalists to latch on to the story.
None of us had experienced a story like this before. We kind of heard rumours. We knew the police were involved at the hospital, that something was happening, but exactly what? I mean, at that stage, I don't think even the police knew what they were facing, what they were coping with. Because nobody knew what was happening, there wasn't that much information to start with, and slowly it started to develop as a story that clearly something big was happening at Grantham, that there was a major investigation, and eventually it did sort of get out there into the media that there had been certainly a number of odd occurrences involving children on the children's ward.
Detectives began to approach family members of the victims with the shocking news that their children may have been deliberately attacked by an active serial killer.
In the early stages of the investigation, the parents certainly had an attitude that suggested that the police should not be interfering with an investigation of this type. I think it's fair to say that as the teams began to investigate the circumstances and they became more and more aware of the circumstances surrounding the collapse of their child, they became more and more on board.
Police had to try and find a link between all 13 of the children who'd been affected. They began with the first suspicious case, the death of 7-week-old Liam Taylor, who'd been left under the care of a new staff nurse, Beverly Allitt.
On the 21st of February of 1991, he was taken to Grantham Hospital and was seen by one of the paediatricians and diagnosed with bronchiolitis. A couple of hours later, they see their child with just a nappy on. He's clearly terribly distressed, And the nurse, Beverly Allitt, explains that during the course of feeding, he'd vomited and choked. The next evening, the two parents decide to stay in the hospital. The mum is so tired that she goes to bed early, and the father stays up. He looks in on the child just before midnight after having had a shower at the hospital and sees that there's a nurse with him. He goes off to bed thinking that the problems are over, and he's awoken about 5 o'clock in the morning by the night sister, who asks him to come because Liam has relapsed. The child's blue, back's arched, and Dr. Nanyakara tells them that he'd stopped breathing and they'd had some difficulty restarting the heart. Later that morning, Liam dies.
Sadly, I had to share with the parents and say, look, this is impossible, but I can't do anything more. I felt so sad. He died in my hands.
The last nurse to tend to Liam before his death was Beverly Allitt, who joined the ward just 4 days previously. It was her first ever nursing role.
So Beverly Allitt had applied to other hospitals, other departments for a job as a nurse upon her completing her qualification, and she'd been turned down by all of them. When Ward 4 employed Beverly Allitt, it was because they were incredibly short-staffed. They were pretty desperate. They needed more nurses on duty, and normally they wouldn't have taken Beverly Allitt on because she didn't have the correct level of qualifications, the usual level of qualifications that they would ask for. So it was desperation, really.
Allitt had begun training as a nurse at 16. Even at a young age, she seemed to have an unhealthy fascination with hospitals.
She was a regular in the A&E department. She would constantly turn up there complaining of various symptoms and illnesses, and she got a bit of a reputation amongst the staff there, so they were very surprised to learn that she was a trainee nurse, and the dots just simply weren't joined up, because often when somebody is a nurse and they're training as a nurse, you're only seeing them, during that part of their day. You're not seeing the bigger picture.
Detectives investigating the suspicious incidents on Ward 4 had begun to look into each case to find a common link. Beverly Allitt had again been on duty on the 5th of March 1991, the day that Timothy Hardwick was admitted.
Timothy Hardwick was an 11-year-old boy who had a lot of problems in his life. He suffered with cerebral palsy and was epileptic. He had an epileptic fit at school in Newark. As a result, he was transferred to Grantham Hospital, where doctors managed to get his fitting under control. A very, very short time after Beverly had been left with him, this child suddenly stops breathing. She raises the alarm, and the crash team are called.
One of the staff nurses came to my office and said, Dr. Nanayakar, can you please come and see Timothy? He is not well. Apparently, he had collapsed, and then when I went there, I tried to resuscitate him, but by that time he virtually had no signs of life.
Sadly, they can't resuscitate him, and the child dies.
Just 5 days later, on March the 10th, 14-month-old Kaylee Desmond was on Ward 4 suffering with a chest infection. After being left alone with Allitt for some one-to-one nursing, Kaylee had an unexpected heart attack.
Beverly Allitt was seen in the room and actually called other nurses to go and have a look, which was one of her common things. She would call other nurses to say, come and have a look at this child, and then the crash team would be called.
Kaylee survived the collapse and was transferred to another hospital. Due to the massive toll the arrest put on her young body, she was left brain damaged. Detectives investigating the unusual pattern of patient collapses on Ward 4 found a clue in Kaylee's x-rays.
We were able to show that there was needle tracking under the arm of this little girl and an air bubble, which had obviously caused the equivalent of what we would call a heart attack.
This mysterious needle mark was further proof to detectives they were dealing with a killer. they'd already discovered the high insulin count in the blood of Paul Crampton, who survived. They continued their investigations with the cases of 2 more suspiciously ill children, Bradley Gibson and 2-year-old Yik Chan.
Bradley Gibson is admitted under Dr. Porter. He was about 5 or 6-year-old and had breathing difficulties. Dr. Porter had treated him with possible chest infection. And he then suddenly had stopped breathing and stopped his heartbeat as well, what we call a cardiac arrest, which is extremely rare. Dr. Porter had tried repeatedly to resuscitate him with the defibrillator. He managed to get him round, extremely fortunate.
Yik Chan was admitted with a suspected fractured skull. He's in the hospital for a couple of days and he's charging around the place. There's clearly not very much wrong with him. One particular evening, Beverly Allitt is going off duty and she speaks to the oncoming nurse at about 9 o'clock in the evening and said, "Can you have a look in at Chan? He's crying, he's not very well." The oncoming nurse goes into the room and finds him with his back arched and blue, and the crash team are called and he's resuscitated.
Bradley Gibson and Yik Chan both survived unscathed. 3-month-old identical twins, Katie and Becky Phillips, were not so lucky. The pair were born prematurely and were regular visitors to Ward 4. In early April 1991, they were back and being treated by Dr. Nana Yakara.
They had repeated admissions, not surprisingly again, with variety of illnesses, diarrhea, vomiting, breathing difficulties, and so on and so forth. And the parents, quite rightly, were very worried and brought them straight to the hospital rather than going to the GP. I had seen them and discharged them, reassured the parents. But the same night, Becky was brought to the casualty. The casualty staff taking lots of effort to resuscitate her, but she was virtually dead. So I had a long discussion with the parents. They were completely shocked and they were very, very upset. I left some blood samples in the laboratory for any future investigations if needed.
And we subsequently found that blood and had it analysed, and that contained 9,660 milliunits per litre of insulin in the blood. And you always have to remember with these huge figures that a child should have 15 to 20 milliunits. So it's horrendous.
Later on that same day, April the 5th, Dr. Nana Yakara asked Becky's parents to bring her twin sister Katie in as a precaution.
Katie's taken into hospital and that afternoon she's allocated to the care of Beverly Allitt. One of the senior nurses goes to that particular room to see what's going on. As she enters, she sees Beverly Allitt nursing the child in her arms. The child's crying. She sees that the child collapse within Beverly Allitt's arms and the crash team are called. They managed to resuscitate Katie, who is later transferred. But over the next 3 days, the child Katie suffers convulsions, and this child is severely brain damaged as a result of what occurred. Now, during my investigation, Detective Inspector Jones managed to find x-rays that were taken at the time. The child had squeeze injuries, which had broken a number of ribs.
This was further evidence that proved to detectives that something very sinister was happening on Ward 4 at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital. Between the deaths of Becky Phillips on the 5th of April and Claire Peck on April the 22nd, 4 more boys had been admitted with minor symptoms and unexpectedly came close to death. That made a total of 13 suspicious incidents, 4 deaths and 9 close calls. But now investigators had the arduous task of making a list of suspects. One of the names on that list was a woman who always seemed to be on duty whenever something went wrong. 22-year-old staff nurse, Beverly Allitt. In May 1991, police were investigating a spate of mysterious deaths and illnesses on the children's ward at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in Lincolnshire. After digging deeper into the individual cases, they were certain they were chasing a serial killer.
There's clear evidence of air injected under the arm of one child. There's evidence of squeeze injuries. There's evidence of insulin. What was a common factor with the vast majority of these children was that each of them had a cannula fitted, a site, usually in the back of the hand, where drugs or drips can be administered through. So injecting cardiotoxic drugs would not be very difficult because it could go in through the IV port.
This is quite a common method for, firstly, a female serial killer and a healthcare serial killer. Poison is a very common method used by these people. It's accessible. It's something that is not going to immediately cause concern because this is something that's already in that hospital environment anyway. And also, poisoning is quite a remote method of killing somebody. You're not up close and personal with them. It's not messy. You can administer the poison and then leave the scene. You don't have to see them suffer the effects of it.
Chief Superintendent Stuart Clifton and his team interviewed all the staff members on Ward 4, and a new piece of evidence emerged that suddenly became crucial.
I began to look at the circumstances of insulin in Grantham Hospital, and I found that it was kept in locked fridges on the wards, and on the children's ward, the key to the fridge had gone missing 3 days before the first child had collapsed. Beverly Allitt was the last known person to have that key, but no hospital investigation had actually taken place.
Beverly Allitt's name kept cropping up. She always seemed to be at the hospital when the incidents occurred, and the staff duty rota confirmed this.
What we discovered was that for every collapse, Beverly Allitt was the only nurse that was on duty on every occasion. And on many of these occasions, we could actually put her right at the bedside, either at the time of the collapse or just before.
On the 21st of May 1991, Stuart Clifton made the brave decision of having Beverly Allitt arrested.
I basically couldn't take the chance that if she was still working on there, she would harm more children, albeit that I hadn't completed the investigation by any means. We were merely scraping the surface at that time. So she was arrested and the house was searched. During the course of that search, we found a hospital pillowcase, a used syringe, and a little child's notebook, and it was headed Allocations Book.
This Allocations Book had gone missing from Ward 4. It detailed the names of children who needed extra attention and which nurse was allocated to them. It was not only further proof that Allitt had been caring for the children who died, but evidence that she was hiding the information from her colleagues.
Beverly Allitt was interviewed at the police station over the course of 2 days. She made no admissions. In fact, she went so far as to distance herself from all the events at that hospital, saying things such as, "I wasn't there on that day. I didn't come on duty until after that had happened." So she completely distanced herself, maintained her innocence. She was a very strange girl in the interview, in that she would talk to you quite normally, or talk to the interviewing officers quite normally about things like football, pop music. And the minute you got down to actually talking about the events at Grantham Hospital, she became a completely different person.
When news of the arrest broke, the press knew this was a huge story.
Once the investigation went that one step further, and obviously a nurse had been arrested, a nurse was clearly under investigation. They had to go public with that, and that's when it all exploded, really. That's when the world's media were suddenly interested, because it had never been heard of before that a nurse would do such a thing. You know, it's such a rarity, and certainly in this country a first. The whole of Grantham was just surrounded by journalists, TV crews from around the world, newspapers.
Allitt's arrest was also a huge shock for the victims' families.
I felt mixed emotions. One is he would want to harm a child, but secondly, we now know what was wrong with Paul, and thank God it's not anything to do with Paul. It's not a medical problem. It is an outside influence.
Stuart Clifton and his team were convinced that Allitt was behind the deaths, but they had no proof. She was released on bail without charge.
I convinced the hospital that they needed to suspend Beverly Allitt from duty because we couldn't take the chance, and they couldn't take the chance, that another child would be attacked.
The police needed to build a case. If they were right about Allitt, then they just released a serial killer into the public. Chief Superintendent Stuart Clifton turned back to the expert who just a month previously had concluded the majority of the cases could be explained medically.
I asked David Hull to go away and re-look at the case notes of the children, but to use the statements that my team had taken, which detailed the circumstances of the collapse of each of these children. He agreed to do that.
Months passed as Stuart Clifton and his team built the case against Beverly Allitt. And by November 1991, Professor Hull had re-examined his original case notes. Based on the new evidence found by detectives, he agreed that all the incidents could be viewed as suspicious. On the 20th of November, Allitt was arrested once more.
The former nurse is charged with the murder of 4 children. She also faces 8 charges of attempted murder of 8 other children. She faces a further 8 charges of causing grievous bodily harm with intent.
She was due to appear at the Grantham Magistrates Court the next day. Bear in mind, this is a young girl that's never been in police custody before. And at 9 o'clock the next morning, one of the police women had to go and wake her up. She didn't appear to have a care in the world.
There wasn't very much in the way of remorse. She didn't cry. There was no kind of real visible reaction in her. So I think she does have that kind of cold personality. She's orchestrated all of these terrible events, but she doesn't feel any impact from them. She's somebody who doesn't have the same feelings and emotions as the rest of us.
During the 15-month wait for her trial, the stunned press began to uncover Beverly Allitt's history of faking illnesses and self-harming.
The more we dug into Allitt's background, again, the more unbelievable it became. And the one question our listeners would ask is, how? How did nobody spot all of this and allow her to continue being a nurse? How did she get through that recruitment process?
We got authorisation from her to have a look at her medical records. They indicated, going back to childhood, that Beverly liked to be the centre of attention. There were incidents while she was at school where she would sprain a finger and demand that her arm be put in a sling.
I think it's tempting to look back and say they should have picked up on that. They should have known that this was somebody who was not quite right. But I don't think they would have automatically made the link between somebody who was perhaps harming themselves and somebody who would then go on to harm other people. Nurses care for their patients. They want to preserve their lives and enhance their quality of life. So to think that a nurse would do this it's almost unthinkable.
On February the 15th, 1993, 24-year-old Beverly Allitt was in Nottingham Crown Court, charged with the murder of 4 children and the attempted murder of a further 9. Her not guilty plea meant a trial would have to take place.
For much of the time, Beverly was not there because she was suffering from anorexia and was supposedly too ill to attend trial. The judge, in his wisdom, ruled that it should go ahead without her.
The court case was a very harrowing experience. I mean, it was a long, drawn-out affair. Beverly Allitt wasn't in court for a lot of it. Again, I think some of that manipulation that she was known for, some of the manipulation she'd clearly done in the hospital. She was trying it with the court case as well, and I know that was having an impact on family members. They knew of their own individual case, but the actual scale of it, apart from what they'd read in the media, heard on the radio, it was the first time they'd actually heard exactly what had been happening at Crampton Hospital.
I mean, that was quite traumatic because obviously there was significant media interest and we couldn't walk down the street from the car park to the court case without having microphones and stuffed under our nose and cameras flashing. And, you know, there's a lot of emotion around that time, clearly.
You couldn't just go home and, you know, close the door and put the TV on and forget about it. It just was all-encompassing. It was the only thing that was on my mind throughout the case and for a long time afterwards as well.
In the times that Allitt was in the courtroom, she seemed completely distanced from what was going on around her.
I firmly believe she felt the families would still be on her side because, you know, they'd been very close. You know, they thought, certainly initially, in those initial stages, that, you know, she'd helped save or tried to save their child's life. And so in court, you know, she would smile at them.
To the outside world, a lot of the evidence may have seemed circumstantial, but as the trial went on, it became clear the case against Allitt was a strong one.
For a long time, people believed it must be a mistake. You know, a nurse surely wouldn't be responsible for that. There must be some other explanation for it. But then slowly, as the evidence was revealed, you could see that tide turning, that people suddenly realised, complete revulsion, that a nurse, of all people, would do that. You know, it's suddenly like, well, if I can't trust a nurse, who can I trust? And I think that was a real shock to the nation. It resonated right across the country when those actual facts came out about what Beverly Allitt had done.
During the trial, the jury heard from experts who believed that Allitt had been suffering with a mental illness throughout her life, which caused her to commit the murders.
Well, Munchausen syndrome is a condition which basically means that people will invent symptoms in themselves in order to gain the attention of medical professionals. There's also Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This is when somebody invents symptoms in somebody else in order to get attention from medical professionals, and that somebody else is often a child or somebody who you're in charge of the care of.
I think she's certainly ill, and there has to be an element of evil somewhere within that, because people can be ill without wishing to cause harm to other people.
On the 28th of May 1993, after a draining 3-month trial, the jury had reached a decision.
I think the moment we were called back into the court is something, you know, I'll always remember. It was very tense, you know, very quiet. The member of the jury stood up, and that first verdict came in of guilty, and there was just again an intake of breath, lasted just a couple of seconds. Then someone, I remember, shouted yes, and I think there was a couple of people clapping, and then tears from the families, tears from members of the public. It was a very difficult job for the police to actually say, you know, without doubt, Beverly Allitt was responsible. So there was always that possibility if the jury could have just tipped the other way. And thankfully, you know, that guilty verdict came in. I think it was a huge sense of relief for everyone.
On May the 28th, 1993, Judge Mr. Justice Latham sentenced Beverly Allitt to 13 concurrent life sentences, one for each of the charges against her. A relieved David Crampton made a statement outside the courtroom.
Well, I saw Beverly Allitt as a rather pathetic figure, really, and when we listened to her medical evidence, we probably could conclude that these tragedies were inevitable.
There was clearly some massive media interest associated with the Allitt case, both pre and post the trial. That was pretty easy for me and my family because Paul was at home and well. If something worse had happened to Paul, such as it happened to other families, how would I have conducted myself? I don't know. Thankfully, I'll never have to know. Paul is 26 years old, he has a house, he has a long-term partner, lovely girl, he's got a career. Paul's doing very well, very, very well.
Beverly Allitt was immediately sent to Holloway Prison, but after just a week behind bars, she was transferred to Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottinghamshire.
I think the fact that Beverly Allitt has ended up in a secure hospital is a really interesting one for me, because this is somebody who, before developing Munchausen syndrome by proxy, could have been argued to have just Munchausen syndrome. So she was fabricating illnesses and symptoms in herself before she was harming other people. She was going after that role as the patient. She wanted to be seen, by medical professionals and play that sick role. She's essentially achieved what she set out to achieve. She's got that status as the patient, which she always wanted.
What do I think about where Allitt's serving her sentence? I don't waste any energy on that. I don't really think about it. She doesn't enjoy the same freedoms that I do, the rest of my family, and the vast majority of the population of this country. She's in a prison. Whether that is more comfortable than perhaps some people would like is a bit academic, really.
In December 1993, Central Television interviewed Beverly Allitt inside Rampton Hospital as part of a special news report.
She enjoys relative luxury and freedom within the maximum security walls. The parents of her victims, who gave their approval for these pictures to be included in Central TV's The Tuesday Special tonight, believe she should be in prison.
It's not too bad.
What's the good thing about it?
We're out, got more freedom in it.
You like it better than where you were before?
Yeah.
Why?
Because I've got more freedom. I'm not locked up all the time.
Stuart Clifton also visited Allitt inside Rampton in 1994, determined to get the truth out of her.
She made admissions at that time. She admitted 9 of the 13 cases that she'd been convicted of. She wouldn't have anything to do with the 2 Phillips cases. The minute that I began to press her for details about precisely what she'd done, what she'd used, she just walked away from me, wouldn't answer any more questions.
There are plenty of questions left unanswered, especially for the loved ones of the victims of Beverly Allitt.
Allitt's crimes are like dropping a pebble into a pool of water. Those ripples spread far and wide. A dramatic effect clearly on the families of the victims, but their extended family, grandparents, parents, etc. And of course a dramatic effect on the hospital and its staff. So her crimes went far and wide into the community, not just the immediate people affected.
I think Beverly Allitt was really most at home when she was in the middle of a drama. So she was deliberately creating the drama and then casting herself in a leading role within it.
There's a real impact there of it could have been a family member. It's the local hospital. One of my members of my younger family could have gone into the hospital to be cared for by a nurse, and look what happened. And that's the thing with this story. It could have happened to absolutely anyone. The parents who were affected by that were purely unlucky that their child went into that hospital on that day and that Beverly Allitt was their nurse.
We may never understand why Beverly Allitt intentionally set out to poison the children she was meant to care for. Her lust for attention turned from selfish to deadly, and for 3 months in 1991, she acted upon it in the most horrific manner. Nobody on Ward 4 was safe. But the determination of doctors and police brought justice for all the victims' families and proved that Beverly Allitt, the angel of death, was a cold-blooded killer.